We will start with our first session. So,
good morning, everybody. 7,593 days ago, 666 kilometers from here in the city of Budapest, that is back in December 2001, the Budapest Open Access Initiative drafted a statement of principles, strategy, and commitment for open access. This document has set our course in many ways for more than 20 years. Has time come to redesign open access? That's the question we are asking in the first session. My name is Charlotte, and I have the honor of chairing this session together with Jadranka. We have shared the role between us so that I'll be the bad cop, keeping the timing, and I'll be very, very strict on that. I'll be sitting right here, just in front of the speakers, raising my hand when they have 5 minutes left, show them 4 minutes, and so on, ensuring that we finish on time. Jadranka will be the good cop, introducing all the speakers. So nice to see you. I hope we have a cheerful and interesting session.
thank you, Charlotte. It's my great pleasure to invite our first two invited speakers, my dear colleagues and friends, Pierre Mounier and Malički. I will just tell you shortly about, so Pierre Mounier is co-coordinator of the Opera's research infrastructure. It's co-director of, or deputy director of Open Edition, promoting open science in social sciences and humanities, and co-director of the Directory of Open Access Books, together with our colleague Niels Stern, which is also present at PubMET2022. Mario, it's our dear colleague from, it's very difficult to say from which institution is Mario. He started his education at University of Zagreb in the field of biomedicine and continued his PhD at University of Split School of Medicine, and then he was working as a postdoc in Amsterdam for a few years. Now it's at metrics department at Stanford University. So Mario, you should really find a place and stay more at one place. So we will have a privilege to hear about a redesign of open access from two different perspectives. Pierre's more humanistic and Mario's more medical point of view. Please, Pierre.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to give a talk to this conference. I love particularly because this is not the first time I came here at PubMet, and really delighted to be able to join you again in presence for this conference. So this is the renewal of a very pleasant tradition that I'm participating in. Okay, so I'm trying to explore the theme of redesigning the scholarly communication ecosystem for inclusion and diversity, particularly under the scope of open access. And first, I'd like to start my presentation by asking a question. Why should we redesign open access? Because I think this is a counterintuitive objective to try to redesign open access for several reasons. First, it's because it seems that open access apparently is usually adopted across different countries at the policy level and got a lot of successes during the last years, the last months, and even the last weeks. So, for example, we heard the news during the summer that the OSTP, which is the Open Science Technology, not Open Science, the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the USA, issued a guidance to all federal agencies to implement open access very soon, and to make sure that all publications coming from research funded by the US taxpayer would be openly available very soon. So this was one of the major news that we got during the summer on the front of open access, which was a kind of tipping point at the level of US, but on the global stage as well. Recently, we had also very good news coming from the Netherlands, saying that there would be a new open science initiative to set up a fund at national level, and a big coordinated initiative with this open science Reiki organ set up under the lead of Hans de Jonge. And that's also one of the signs that shows the success of open access. That you mentioned that started more than 20 years ago, and now 20 years after the beginning of the movement, we can see that the success is coming and the adoption seems to be wide. I could multiply the examples. So, for example, this announcement coming from Italy this time with the adoption of an open science policy that includes strong measures in terms of development of open access. So this is one of the different, also the different signs that shows this success. At European and international level, it's interesting to see that there is a growing coordination between open science policies between the different countries, with the development of the CONOSC, which is this network, this Council for National Open Science Coordinators, which is growing. I'm very pleased to see that Croatia is part of the CONOSC. And this is also a sign that open access and open science more largely are becoming mainstream and widely adopted, at least at policy level. So you see here the map showing the list of the countries who joined CONOSC. So it's already something very important, and I'm sure that the network and the council will extend in the coming years. In terms of adoption now, and let's have a closer look at the quantitative data that supports those signs of adoption and success. So coming from France, I'd like to present to you some data that comes from my country. So at national level, we have developed an open science barometer, which tries to evaluate with a sound methodology the level of adoption and the share of open access publications amongst the total number of publications authored by French researchers. And then you can see globally that there is this strong growth in terms of adoption of open access amongst the French research community, with more than 10 points growth during the last year. In Netherlands, they have also their open science monitor, and you can see that there is a strong growth. Now we have more than 70% of publications authored by Dutch researchers that are open access. So this is another example, and we could once again multiply the examples. But of course, this is a global view, a global landscape, which shows a global growth and a global success of open access. But there are blind spots. And this is why probably we should try to work on redesigning as much as possible open access to address those blind spots, and more particularly the challenges that came along the development of open access during the 20 last years. So of course there are a lot of challenges, a lot of blind spots. I selected for this talk 3 challenges that I consider as the most important to address in the coming years. First one, it's the challenge and the blind spot of consolidation. we have now a number of research and publication in the information and library science domain, showing and evidencing that behind the development of open science and open access, there is a strong movement ongoing with the consolidation of position by a few commercial companies who, by buying and merging other companies, in fact, dominate the whole scholarly publishing landscape. So this has been evidenced many times. And for example, here you have an extract coming from a publication that was done by several researchers, including Leslie Chan and George Chen, published in the PubMet, not PubMet, but LPub conference 2019 proceedings. There is another challenge, which is the question of domination and how a system of power which is embedded in the knowledge production system or ecosystem continues, even though there is a global shift towards open access in this knowledge production system. This has been evidenced and pointed out by our colleague Leslie Chan in a recent speech that he gave at Force 11 conference. And you can see here how he shows that all across the knowledge production system, coming from the paywall system to the copyright system, but also at the level of the infrastructures, there are power structures that put away and put aside several communities, several profiles of researchers based on their socioeconomic profile, for example, or from their origin or from their gender, of course. And also that put away and that don't give enough visibility and enough room for epistemes, so ways of thinking and producing knowledge inside the system. So the system is still dominated by specific ways of producing knowledge and also dominated by power positions all across the system. Now, the third challenge, and I'd like to take some minutes on this, some minutes more on this challenge, is about inequality in terms of being able for several scientific communities to adopt open science and more particularly open access. I come back now to the French Open Science Monitor, and I will try to present to you some more precise data about this adoption of open access in the French national landscape. Here you have, and it's a little bit difficult for me to look at it. Okay. Here you have a distribution of open access by type of publication in France during the last year, so from 2020. And you can see that the distribution of open access is unequal, is uneven across the different types of publications, with of course a lot of a huge adoption of open access for the publication of preprints. This is normal. But we have also 65% of the articles which are published open access, but 41% only at the level of the proceedings, conference proceedings, and only 29% for the book chapters and only 23% for the books. So there is a strong inequality because if you publish an article or if you publish a book, then the access to open access and the adoption of open access is really different. Now, if I look at the distribution of open access across the different languages of publications, I see that there is a strong difference also depending on the languages of publication. So you may ask yourself, why do we have several languages of publication? Whether we are looking at the French national context, it's because the French researchers, of course, they publish not only in French and English, but also because a lot of them are working in humanities and social sciences. They publish in German, in Spanish, Portuguese, and so on. So you see that also for the English language, there is a strong adoption, like 66%. But when we go to the Spanish language, now it's 63%. And when we go to the French language, it's only 38%. I see for the German, 33%. And for Portuguese, 74%. So that's interesting because it shows how there are strong differences in terms of adopting open access across the different languages of publication. And of course, this has an impact in terms of visibility for those languages and the presence of those languages in the scholarly publication ecosystem. And of course, the last part of the inequality is about the differences between different disciplines. And you see here the distribution of adoption of open access across different disciplines. So, of course, I won't go into different detail in the details of the different disciplines, but you can see that from the mathematics to the humanities and the social sciences, there is a strong difference in terms of adoption. Here you can see the same, so those are this is based on the same data. You can see that the distribution between mathematics at the top and social sciences at the bottom level is really different. But this is also interesting to have a look at the strongest growth. So the distribution of the growth of the adoption of open access during the last 4 years. And here you see that, let's say, the ranking is quite different. So, for example, in France, the adoption of open access by the chemist scientific community was the strongest in the last years, followed closely by the humanities. So it's interesting to see that researchers in humanities recently, they adopted a lot more the open access than other disciplines. And then we can go to see that the dynamics of adoption can be very different from one discipline to another. So based on this point and these facts, the question is, how should we try to address those challenges, those gaps, those blind spots? How should we try to redesign open access? And how should we try to find a method, to look for a method to redesign the landscape? Being French, when someone tells me about, and being very far away from the domain of design, when someone talks to me about design, I have a mental image coming immediately in my mind, which is Philippe Starck. 5 minutes, perfect. So, you know, this very prominent figure of the genius designer who has a grand vision and who creates beautiful objects, such as the juice maker. And for me, in a naive perception of design, this is it. This is design. And of course, when I saw the topic that was presented by the conference, I didn't see the connection between this kind of activity and what we should do to restructure or to change the landscape. But fortunately, of course, there are many ways of doing design, and there are other ways of doing design. So I started to read about the different traditions in design. And of course, I found some practices of design which are more participatory and more open. So if we want to redesign open access, it should be natural to open the design process. And I found that in Scandinavia, in the late 70s or early 80s, there was a tradition in the UX design and the IT development of co-designing those interfaces and those IT systems with the users themselves and with the community themselves. So since then, there is a strong tradition of co-design, which involves the participation, the active participation of the users and the community to design together something that fits the need of the community and that doesn't come from the sole mind of a genius visionary. And that's what I like. So, of course, at Opras, for example, we have a small experience of co-design, for example, for the development of the triple platform. So now we'll talk about it during the morning or during the day. We have done and prepared co-design workshops that involve the users and the community to design the platform. So now I just want to end my presentation. Yes, 3 minutes. Is it what you 3 minutes? Oh. Okay, okay. I just want to end in 2 minutes now my talk by a proposition to reopen co-design open access. And I think this should be the full title of the session, rather than just redesign. Of course, a good way to reopen co-design open access is to have and continue organizing conferences such as PubMet as we have now. And most of the speakers before me, you mentioned how it was good and important to meet face-to-face again. So this is a way to reopen and to co-design open access by being able to talk together and to speak together about how the type of open access that we want for our scientific community. So this is, of course, the first landmark for that. With some organizations, and particularly under the lead of Science Europe, in the recent months, we have elaborated an action plan for Diamond Open Access. Most of you know this, I guess, this action plan, but the way the action plan was designed and the content of the action plan and the way we propose it to the community is also another example of how we want to open the design process to elaborate the future open access and the future open science that we want for our communities. Here you have, of course, the reading of the plan, and so far 125 organizations across the world have subscribed and undersigned the plan. So this is a success in terms of also opening the design process. We have organized in February, last February, an online workshop to have the community participate into the implementation and co-design the implementation of this action plan. And so this is another way. And of course, just after the PubMet conference, there will be a follow-up conference that will be the Diamond Open Access Conference right here in Zadar. So I encourage you to stay here in Zadar to participate to this conference and enjoy, of course, the excursions during the weekend to make the bridge between the two conferences. Thank you very much for your attention, but more precisely, thank you very much for your participation, because this is the ground for future co-design. Thank you.
I wasn't sure if we're doing questions first or presentation. Yes. Good morning, everyone, and thank you. It's really an honor to be here. As Jadranka said, I did jump through a lot of universities and I think I've worked in at least 8 universities around the world. I was very lucky, and I consider that to be one of the aspects of open access, when an individual, maybe from a small country like this, is able to come from a middle class family and actually rise up to ranks and now work at Stanford University. I never thought that when I was a kid that I would be looking at the Golden Gate Bridge or being there at all. I didn't think that was a possibility. So I'm very honored to be here. So honored actually, and so in love with this conference that I haven't been home for 2.5 years, and I visited this conference before I even go to see my parents. So I'll go and visit them after this. So I'm very honored to be here. But I know we haven't really had our coffee yet, but I'll try to be a little bit more controversial, maybe ask a little bit of participation from you. I haven't done any, and that you need to click on anything, but maybe raising of hands will be enough. Now, if we do talk that since more than 20 years, we have started open access. And I don't know if you're aware, but in the April of this year, the Curtin University Let's go. I hope you've seen that in the April of this year, the dashboard of open access has been published, and it covers all the publications from 2020, sort of indexing Crossref and Microsoft Academic Graph and using unpaywall data. And it basically showed that more than 53% of publications are still closed. So if we think that for 20 years we've been talking about open access and trying to achieve it, can I see a raise of hands of how many of you think that we have succeeded? And I think that's where we sort of have to question ourselves. There's been a great news this year that came up. If you're aware of the Open Reference Initiative, it took them only 5 years to achieve that every reference in Crossref is now freely available to everyone. But we've been doing open access for more than 20 years, and maybe we have failed if only 50% of publications are out there. How many of you work in universities that have made it mandatory to publish everything in open access? So we've heard of NIH initiatives, European or Horizon initiatives, where we say that funders can sort of impose on us that if they fund our research, then they can demand open access. And all of us praise that, and we're very happy when a new funder comes out of that. But we've seen when it comes to the bottom-up approaches, we are unable to do that. So none of us have, even though a lot of us are working in this field, none of us here present, because I've seen no raise of hands, have managed to convince our own university that all of our researchers should be publishing open access. And I think we need to question ourselves, why is this so difficult? And I know that we know the incentives, and I know that we know how difficult it is, to publish and perish or staying in the system. But I think this is where we see a majority of the problem. We love open access, but implementing it in our own departments, or having, really clear statements that all of our postdocs, or all of our PhD students, or all of our professors will publish exclusively open access is something that we don't really see. If we look at lately of Open Alex, I hope the community here is aware of the Open Alex, the new free scholarly database that aims to do everything completely free, and hopefully then we can maybe less stop using the commercial publishers for search of data. They have announced 15 days ago, not even 15 days ago, that 57 million articles have now full text search. But this is 57 million out of more than 160 million. So we're talking about a third. So we're not there yet when it comes to what we actually want to achieve, that we can access any paper, from anywhere in the world without limits or where we come from. And I think one of the things when we talk about redesigning of open access, it's because we've been always stuck on talking about peer review publications or conference proceedings. But open access isn't just that. Open access is the ability to go to university, to see protocols, to see curricula, to see courses at other universities that you can openly access from anyone else. And we've been stuck on this part, thinking that the other part is not really where we come as sort of researchers. If we look at ORCID ID, which is supposed to sort of hopefully be a map of all the researchers around the world, we also see that when we look at the country distribution and how much it has been implemented, that it's still globally around 50% or less researchers actually using ORCID ID. So if you want to conduct a survey, if you know how many researchers are there, and if you want to talk about diversity and inclusion, how many women are in the system, or how many specific races or anything is out there. We don't even have a database that we can say there's this many active researchers right now in the world, this many of them are women, this many of them are of this gender, or anything that we want to talk about. And I think that's another issue that we need to think when we're thinking of redesigning the system. Now, of course, a lot of us maybe fear a little bit of that big brother, because one of the aspects that comes with open access is the freedom of information to anyone know everything about you. We want to publish everything. We want to include our ORCID ID for every publication and what we do. But that means that anyone elsewhere in the world, when we do this, is able to access where I have been in all these 8 universities, at what time, who has funded my research, and all of our information becomes a public property. I don't know if you've heard of the new initiative of the big publishers that are now collecting data about our gender, race, and ethnicity. Of course, with our willingness to share that data. And the reason why they're collecting this data is that we can actually then say, do we have a bigger number of female researchers or male researchers applying for grants, being awarded grants, publishing in journals or not? If we want to do gender equality, if we want to do race equality or other things, we need this information. But getting that information also means that we are maybe susceptible and need to consider our quotas the way we want to go. We know that in the European Commission, they have aimed to have 50% of genders represented when we come to grant reviewers, or 50% of females also being awarded grants. But assigning a quota to a position of how many professors we're going to hire, how many PhD students we're going to hire, takes much more steps. How many people are we going to hire, especially in a global world? We don't really often talk about that. If you as a researcher, like I did, go and work abroad, we have seen that it's extremely difficult to come back. The systems are not meant for that. And we don't have clear quotas of how many foreigners we are going to allow in our universities to work there. We all want to embrace this global world of where everything is sort of accessible to all of us, but it's very hard to define how many foreign researchers at specific universities you're going to accept. How many of which gender? Will you have this percentage of non-binary, this percentage of Asian population, this percentage of, whatever we talk about in specific countries. Now, when you come from Croatia, I remember a few years ago when we had our famous, football matches, it was a big sort of thing in the newspapers that we are one of the whitest countries in the world. And we are, of course, very small, and we have always been very white, and it was portrayed as something back as if we are responsible for ourselves for being white in the first place. But then, you come to, I worked in Amsterdam, which has 180 different countries living out there, but then you look at who's at the top professorship positions, and you see it's majority of the Dutch people. And we shouldn't blame them, because it is a country where you are, and each country has to support their own population first. But it's easy to accept a postdoc to come on such an institution, but to promote it to a full tenure institution is something quite different. Stanford University, where I've been working now for 2.5 years, have for the first time ever in their history conducted a diversity and inclusion survey last year. And they have shown that only 33% of women are on the top associate professor or professorship position, meaning on a tenure position, there's only 33% of women. They looked at race diversity as well, and they saw that there's 80% of Asians, but there's only 6% of Asians in the population. There's 12% of population, there's 12% of blacks, but there's only 2% of black professors hired. Now, in Croatia, we often don't need to think about the race ratio because we don't maybe have it, but in other countries we do. And how to ensure that we reward people based on open access publications or open data publications, and yet satisfy these beautiful ideals that we have of equal society, of equity, is not that simple. No one wants to be hired just because of their sex or because of their race, but unless we do promote that kind of hiring, we will never achieve that kind of representations. If you live in California right now, where I live, and there's more than, I think, 19 or 20% of Latino population or Latino origin population, and then you have less than 1% of those kind of professors, then you don't have role models. You don't have role models. You don't know that that's achievable to you as a student. I don't know if you've seen the little news that's been going around now, around TikTok and everywhere, with the new Ariel movie, The Little Mermaid, and the reactions of Black girls seeing that the mermaid is Black. we often don't think about these things coming from a very specific country, but if we want open access to be used for diversity and inclusion, we need to know what and how we're going to implement it in our own universities or our own departments. How many of us have, if you are in the leading position to actually now choose a team, thought about, do you have a diversity and inclusion statement? Will you hire a specific number of foreigners within your department, or try to ensure that, when we know how difficult it is even to ensure, you know, our own postdocs or our own students to get those positions. Let's see if this still works. So I'd like to take a little bit bigger leap when I talk about open access, not to talk exclusively about open access publications. When we start a research project, ideally we should start with an authorship agreement. How many journals or projects, when you start, have a little sentence of saying, did you consider gender or race diversity starting with this project? Why do you have 4 males and 1 female on these projects instead of an equal distribution? And that is something that we can work on. I don't know if you were aware, but recently Elsevier has published for the first time ever an open peer review database of everything that happens in peer reviewed scholarly publications. So the first time ever that a publisher has shared with the research community an open database of how many reviewers they invite per manuscript, how many accepted, how many actually gave the reviews, what were their genders, and everything out there. And in order to researchers to access this database, they're asking a protocol, but they're also asking for the first time ever this question, have you considered gender equality? We cannot force it. There's no laws right now to tell us that we can force these things, but we can at least maybe mention it when we're doing something. Consider this when you're making your team. Consider racial, consider gender diversity. And it starts with agreeing on the authorship. And we know how important authorship is in everything that we do in science, because that's how we make our careers. And there's no, you know, clear guidance on what authors are or not. There's many existing ones like the ICMGA rules or the credit taxonomy that try to define what we do, but they don't really force us again on what we do. When we talk about pre-registering your study and telling to the world what we've done, we know that this is, again, not really a practice that is being implemented everywhere in the world. But it would be great for young researchers that they could see top scientists in the world and how their plans for research actually look like. And do they have even an authorship agreements in those plans, and how they're going to, you know, deal whenever have authorship disputes among themselves. I don't know if you heard, it was, I think, 3 years ago when the Swedish government for the first time implemented an Office of Research Integrity. And they saw that I think they received around 25 cases of complaints about possible, you know, issues happening with the research integrity. But what was the surprise, 12 of those were within the relationships between younger researchers and older. So it had nothing to do with fabrication of data, falsification of data. It was the problem that we, as humans, often don't collaborate perfectly with one another. And then they had to turn down those cases and say it's up to the universities to help and mediate and, you know, control how their scientists work. They thought they would only be getting cases of suspected fraud or suspected plagiarism, and not the problems of bullying or abuse or, you know, gift or ghost authorships that happen in academia. When we collect data, do we share it? Do we write up our studies using, you know, reporting guidelines? And these, of course, differs between different fields, but we know that there's more 400 reporting guidelines right now out there in the world, and it's not always easy to find them and consider why is this important for open access. In 2018, we conducted a survey on 100,000 researchers. Getting emails of 100 researchers is also not open access. We have done everything that we can to prevent now in the scholarly databases for a researcher so easily access your email address. Yet we want everyone to have an ORCID ID and be able to contact them, but not really that we want to be able to so easily, you know, run these huge surveys. And we've seen that the support for the things that we're talking about isn't yet there. Only 60% of researchers agreed that they want to share data, but only 20% said that they want to share protocols or write analysis plans. So I think we often come at a very late stage when we think that open access is already maybe successful. We've been talking about it for 20 years, it's going in the right direction, but if we're still at the idea where we're not there yet, where we don't agree all about open access, where we don't agree all about sharing protocols or sharing course materials online, writing your books in an open accessible way that it can be accessed by anyone, then we are not really there yet. We've done a similar survey with Ksenia here as well on open access in Croatia. I know this is very local, but I have to sort of mention a little bit of that. And we are a small research community. We're a small country, 4 million people, that it is really small. You know, some cities where I lived are much bigger than that. Some villages in China are bigger than that and not even on the map. And, you know, and so it's very different when you talk about that. And I haven't even touched, I am an editor of a journal which is called a Journal of Research Integrity and Peer Review. I haven't talked about today a lot about open peer review, but if we want open access, we need to know what happens on that side as well. We need to implement open peer review, and it's currently in less than 1% of journals, and we have more than 50,000 journals out there in the world. Less than 1% share the reviews with the world and know how that process goes. And when we asked our scientists here, we saw that around 50% of those that responded to our survey said that they would be willing to participate in open peer review, but only 12% at the time posted anything on a preprint server. And that's another open access route that we have, you know, sharing our authors' manuscripts. If we are forced by publish or perish culture to still go in subscription journals, or, you know, rather at least we could be posting our own submitted manuscripts or our preprints, but it isn't out there yet. So I think we really need to, when we talk about redesigning, we need to redesign ourselves. We need to think, why is this? Do we have a clear guide that we want to be a part of this community? Since when year can we, you know, make a pledge that I will stop publishing if I don't publish open access or if I don't share my preprint? Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. So we will have discussion at the end of the session, and I would like to invite now Vanessa Proudman, our next short talk speaker. And Vanessa will present us the current state of rights retention strategy and initiatives related to rights retention strategy. Because of some legal issues, authors of this short talk ask for this talk not to be recorded. So our online participants will have 10 minutes to grab a coffee or walk for a short time. So our online participants, see you in, no? No. Okay. Okay.
So, yeah, no, everybody is seeing our talk. I think there was a misunderstanding. Sure. So I'd like to come back to that question about design and what is good design. I'm talking about copyright. You might not necessarily associate Philip Stark with copyright. It's not necessarily the sexiest of topics, but if you think about good design or industrial design, it needs to work. And copyright is not working for an equitable open access, an author who wants to publish open access. It's not necessarily working for them. We want all of our authors to be able to publish open access, regardless of their financial capacities, that they can share and self-archive. We've been working in open access for 20 years, and this is a design flaw. So how can publishers change their ways when funders, for example, at Coalition S, are calling and insisting that our authors should retain their rights rather than transfer those rights? Publishers are still asking authors to transfer their rights. There is change in open licensing, but there's really still a lot to be done. And I'm going to tell you very briefly about a project funded by the Arcadia Fund as part of Knowledge Rights 21 program, how we really need to mobilize our authors, our institutions who are closest to the authors, to set policies, to enable them to publish OA. And we also want to encourage the publishers in the room to also move forward. Some publishers have We did talk about this 2 years ago, and on one of those elements, only in the last 2 years, there's been 6% change in this area for the positive publishing of OA. So that's why I'm still here and still going on about this very unsexy topic, but very important topic. Move forward. How do I move? It's not moving. So I'm going to talk about the project Retain. As I said, it's really important still now more than ever for our authors to publish and share, be able to adapt and allow others and them.
It's my pleasure now to invite Delwen Franzen for the next short talk. Yeah, and we will hear now short, about very interesting topic. It is difficult to obtain self-archiving rights. Okay.
All right. Hello, everyone. So I'm very excited to be here. It's actually my first PubMet, so I look forward to meeting all of you. I'm based at the Quest Center in Berlin. So the Quest Center aims to increase the value and reduce the waste in biomedical research and make research more trustworthy and useful for scientists and society at large. So today I'm going to tell you about leveraging openly available tools to move towards increasing the realized potential of green open access. So last year, UNESCO adopted its recommendation on open science and outlined several priority areas for action that move towards open science at large scale, and highlighted also the importance of, among others, equitable access, and also the need to support non-commercial infrastructure and publishing models. Now, evidence shows that open access of journal articles is increasing, but many publications still remain behind a paywall, and of course that limits the impact of a lot of research, and it generates inequity. So this is just a plot of from a recent publication that looked at open access in the German research landscape, and that's actually also the context of the work that I'll be presenting today. Now, several studies have looked into whether the potential of self-archiving or green open access has been realized, and they found that it had not. But arguably, it's a very strong mechanism to make research accessible, to bring more equity, right. So, and particularly in research contexts where, for example, such as in Germany, mandates for green open access are extremely rare. So based on that, I was keen to see how we could leverage openly available tools to generate actionable data on self-archiving to increase science discoverability at scale. And to do that, I used two tools, I used Unpaywall and Share Your Paper, and I'll talk about that a bit later. And I looked into this issue in a cohort of publications from clinical trials conducted at German university medical centers. Just briefly, these were interventional clinical trials registered in clinicaltrials.gov or the German Clinical Trial Registry, completed between 2009 and 2017, led by a German university medical center. And then we did a lot of manual work to actually find the earliest results publications of these clinical trials. And so we ended up with almost 2,000 publications published between 2010 and 2020. And so the first question I asked is, well, how many of these clinical trial publications are behind a paywall? And for that, of course, I used Unpaywall. I just queried Unpaywall via its API, and this is the result. So I'm not going to go into the individual breakdowns of the categories, but my main point is that out of the almost 2,000 publications, 46% of them were still behind a paywall, despite some of them being out there since many years. So my next question was, well, of these paywall publications, how many could be made openly accessible based on self-archiving permissions. And for that, I used Share Your Paper. And just a quick show of hands, who has heard of that tool in the room? Okay, one, I think, I see, or two. Yeah, so what is Share Your Paper? So Share Your Paper combines paper metadata and policy information to automate permissions checking at the level of individual articles. So it doesn't just take self-archiving policies, it also takes, for example, institutional open access policies or funder mandates, and it tries to bring this all together and really generate actionable data. And all this information is completely machine readable, and it can be used to inform interventions like I'm going to show you later. And this all comes together in this website, and you can see a screenshot of that here. So essentially, it tries to make the deposit process easier for researchers. So you can see here, researchers can just enter a DOI, and then the idea is that it just, of a publication they want to archive, and then the system just automatically checks for self-archiving permissions, and then, you know, if that's possible, it will ask the researcher for the appropriate version of the publication, and then the researcher gives that version, and then the system just automatically does the deposition process in Zenodo, including deposit statement and so forth. So you can see that it automates permissions, but it also turns that into a very usable tool. Now, before I show you what I did with this tool for this cohort I mentioned, I just want to show you a short glimpse into what the API response of this tool is, because happy for me, they have an API. And so here you can see an API response for a given publication, and you can see the best permission at the top, which is the easiest permission to archive the publication in an institutional repository. And you can see the API response gives a lot of different information, such as the version that can be deposited, where it can be deposited, the embargo, and also the calculated end date based on the embargo. And so in my cohort, I considered publications archivable if I could find a best permission to archive the accepted or the published version in an institutional repository, and if the embargo had elapsed, if there was one, of course. And this is what it looks like. So you can see in light green all the publications that are currently paywalled but could technically be made openly available based on the self-archiving permissions. So that corresponds to 84% of the sample, and I think that's actually an underestimation still. So that actually, you know, follows previous results that have shown that the potential of green open access is indeed not being realized. And the key message I want to put across here is that all this is actionable information that can inform efforts to increase science discoverability. And in the last few minutes, I just want to talk to you about how I use that data together with colleagues at Quest. And we integrated this data in a pilot intervention to increase clinical trial transparency at the Charité. So we were interested, like beyond open access, we also looked at how trials at the Charité were performing on other transparency practices, such as results reporting. And then we wanted to see if telling researchers about the performance of their trial could actually lead to improvement. And so to test that, we generated report cards at the level of individual trials that provide feedback on a trial's transparency and concrete recommendations on how to improve. And that looks like this. This is a sample report card, and don't worry about all the details, but the point is on each row you can see a different transparency practice. The report card then gives feedback on how that trial performed on that practice, and where applicable, it also gives recommendations on how to improve if that's needed. And I'm just highlighting here at the bottom, you can see open access. So for this trial, we found a publication, but the publication was not open access. However, we found a permission to archive this publication in the accepted form. And then you can see on the right, we give concrete recommendations saying, well, you know, you can still change this. You can either deposit it via Share Your Paper or just contact your library to support you with that process. And the key point is that these report cards are generated automatically, completely automatically with code. And they just take the information from, you know, the self-archiving that was also generated automatically. And then just depending on what the self-archiving permission is, it just updates the report card accordingly. So that makes it scalable. So that's the exciting thing. And with that, I just want to conclude and just say that I showed you that many results publication in a cohort of clinical trial publications from German universities remain behind a paywall when they don't need to be. And actually that's also not in line with World Health Organization guidelines that ask researchers to make the publications of clinical trials openly accessible wherever possible. And I hope I could show you also that tools that we can use tools to obtain actionable information on self-archiving at scale. And I think here it might be helpful to, this could be helpful to support efforts to populate repositories, particularly if you can archive the published version. Other than that, I think it can really inform a lot of interventions, such as the one I just showed you, and particularly for recently published articles, given that authors are more likely to still have the appropriate version that can be archived, and also given that share your paper allows for, it can also do embargoed deposits to Zenodo. So I think that's quite an exciting thing to consider as well. And maybe a final reflection is that I think the importance of voluntary self-archiving also will partly depend on existing mandates. So with that, I want to thank you very much for your attention and thank all the people at Quest that helped. And yeah, I really look forward to connecting. So just do come and talk to me. Thank you.
Our next speaker and the last speaker in this session is our colleague Iva Melinščak Zlodi, coming from University of Zadar, and Iva will tell us more about the landscape of scholarly book publishing in Croatia.
Hello, everyone. For the next and the last 10 minutes in this session, I will ask you to follow me to delve deeper into one of the definitely blind spots, as Pierre named them, and this is the publishing of scholarly books in Croatia and publishing especially in open access. I will try to talk about this very narrow and national subject, and I hope that it will have some more broader relevance and resonance. So before I start, I will explain how I decided to do this little exercise, what motivated me. And it was, first of all, it was the work in one of the opera's special interest groups on open access business models, which was, and I thank to the colleagues, especially those who stayed, who were in this narrow circle finishing the white paper. These discussions were very rewarding, but at the same time, for me personally, they were often very frustrating because the focus was mainly on innovative business models, on collaborative ones. And when we looked at the survey, the results that we gathered, it was really evident that none of those models took ground in Europe or even in Eastern Europe at all. So the question is, why is that? And this is something I hope that will help me understand better and explain better to others. The other group that I was also involved in the last months is the group working on the national open science policy in Croatia. And again, there was a group of people with whom I often disagree and discussed in a good manner. And the issue of books was really something that bothered us. So I thought that this kind of evidence-based approach, where we look at the landscape, try to understand it and picture it, would help us in reaching some sort of achievable transition. So not only defining principles that we want to have in our open access national policy, but really having something that is finally achievable and that will lead to more open access books. In that case, I think we have to rely on accurate and detailed insights into what is really happening on national and regional arena. So this sort of research study or a little exercise in the data is going to show us who
who are key stakeholders in Croatian book publishing? What are their, who are they and what are they like? And what is the current level of adoption of open access among those scholarly publishers in Croatia? And this exercise will be based on two sets of existing data. One is from the Ministry of Science and Education in Croatia, and it's public data on subsidies for scholarly books. And the other one is from Croatian scientific bibliography. And they will both cover this period from 2018 to the last year, 2021. To briefly describe these two sources of data, one is the, as I said, publicly available registry of subsidies that are delivered to book publishers in Croatia. And it is important to say that this is the main funding source for all book publishing that is going on. It is not only, but it is definitely the dominant one. And the other set is the scientific bibliography that is populated by authors themselves and likely edited by librarians. So it is probably not really exhaustive, and in many cases the data are not fully exact, and they had to be cleaned a lot. But this bibliography gives us very valuable additional information to the one from the ministry. It shows us some publishers that do not receive grants and subsidies, but still publish open access books. And it also shows us, unlike the first database, that which books are published in electronic form, especially if they are open access, and also in which kind of open access. Is it self-archived repository based or something on the publisher platform, which is also very important when planning a future policy and plan. And also, I wanted to see how much do these rare publishers who do publish open access, do they follow some international acknowledged standards of digital publishing? Do they allow for discoverability, standardized metadata, indicators, and so on? So what did I find? Before I go on, I have to mention that there was a previous study. It was also presented here on PubMed by colleagues Velagic and Horvat. And one interesting point, I was not going to look into the journals, but from their research, it was very evident that the landscape of journal publishing and book publishing in Croatia is very, very different. Almost all journals are in open access, while very few books are. And also, one of the explanations for that is that most of the journal publishing is happening within institutional public publishers, while books are published in majority by private for-profit publishers. So when we look at this grant subsidies data, what we can see, I've put some sums and some numbers here just for the context. But I think what is important is the division that you can see in the side. More than 50% of books that are subsidized by public grants are published by small and medium-sized private enterprises. There are no big publishers in Croatia. They are all either small or there are few middle-sized, but they are the major driving forces for book publishing. Many of them are not really for-profit in the common sense. They are often mission-driven, small, scholar-led, but they are still private commercial publishers. The other half is mostly around institutional publishers, either higher education institutions or institutes or societies. And also just to mention that there are few publishers who are the biggest among them. And one that is really, it is institutional, but is the biggest one is my own institution, Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, but after that there follows few of the commercial ones. So if the landscape is dominated by commercial publishers, then we have to ask what is going on with open access books and with electronic editions at all. And it's interesting to see that among those publishers, when we look at the Crosby database, we can find that there are only 2 open access books published by the commercial publishers. And even then, when we look closely, one is by the author that is dedicated to open access, so it was definitely her initiative, and the other is also from the author who is the leader of the Communist Party in Croatia, so also someone who is personally dedicated to sharing. So it's not up to publisher initiative to publish in open access. And there are another myth buster that commercial publishing in Croatia is definitely not about BP series or selling paywall access. So this is also something that is mainly not happening except into exceptions. So who publishes open access titles? Again, those are institutional publishers in most cases, with also some governmental offices and NGOs, and in many cases authors themselves in their own are publishing their own books. Books are usually available, these open access books are usually available either on, for these 2 faculties, the University of Zadar and my own, on the platforms that are powered by Open Monograph Press, so they are standardized and discoverable. In some cases, in institutional repositories, not by authors, but by publishers themselves. And in many cases, simply on the websites of publishers without any metadata, without identifiers. And this is something that is really interesting indicator that only 3 publishers are registering the DOIs, and there are only 32 DOIs registered for Croatian books. So it's not really a good sign, and I would like to conclude with some important messages that if we want to build a future plan that will enable open access books in Croatia, we have to be realistic, and we have to think how to build infrastructure first, then to have a certain policies that will, and they have to be conditional. These grants, subsidies have to be conditioned by the open access has to be some sort of prerequisite to getting a public grant. And also these public funding models need to encourage development for publishers, not just publishing as it is now. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
And may I invite other speakers of this session to sit here. And now we have 10 minutes for discussion, and our speakers will be happy to answer your questions. You just raise your hand if you have questions, so our students will bring microphone to you.
I have a question for the last speaker, because I'm interested in open access publishing books. So that just medical social sciences where you don't have metrics such as the impact factor and similar. Supposed to present. Never mind. So in the it is the social factor, the impact factor or other methods for office. Have you ever thought about how this could, for example, the open access to books and looking at the data and everything, how this could impact actually citations and maybe bring something from environmental science or similar science where you don't have the impact factor, it also affects funding and everything else. It will bring the impact factor of some symbolic humanities, having open access to books which you can cite and then you can track them off as measures that will also affect funding in the long term. And is there any research or any idea about that?
Well, as far as I know, there is a lot of research in that area, and there are also not just research, but there are also ideas what should be done and how it should be done. And I think that the general idea, and I would agree with that, is that we shouldn't introduce metrics that is currently used and usually used for journals into the big world, and that especially to the book world of humanities and social sciences, it wouldn't really help us in recognizing quality, and it could be detrimental to the world of publishing and working in the academia in these areas. There are, however, there are ways, and I think that one of the future projects that is going to be introduced next week is going to talk about the standards and quality standards of open access publishing that would also be extended to the books, but it's not at the point we don't have clear vision of how that should work, that how should that be developed in an operational way. So I think we are not far from final solutions for that. And I guess that in the audience there are people who know more about this and who also help me answer these questions.
Could I maybe add to that? I think we should be striving for another impact factor for books. So the good news is that the European Commission, together with the EUA and Science Europe, will be really looking at how we should be assessing research and reinventing that. So I think we see within the communication that there is a real call to action and to change how we assess our research within our institutions, and books is just one of those means to share our research results. So I think that's the future. And I know it's not a quick fix, but that's where we should be putting our energy into, and also talking to the vice rectors about that and about the importance of books in particular disciplines rather than thinking about new impact factors. Thanks.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you all for very interesting and inspiring talks, and especially you, Mario. Much of what you said has been felt very much in my career as a researcher in terms of gender equality, no problem with that. But my question is not related to the equality discussion, but rather to the fact that when I teach PhD students about responsible public research and I encourage them to upload preprints, they always confront me with the question, well, is it a good thing to have two versions of the same paper, like you have the preprint and you have the printed version? And I always encourage them to do that, but they argue they don't want to have two versions available. What will be your response to that?
I'm going to talk tomorrow a little bit about, to me, the main reason why we should be publishing preprints is either one of those kind of publishing system to differentiate what is the actual contribution to journals. Unless I see a submitted version, I don't know if the journal is that. We often don't talk about that. We think of publishing as simply the experience of research, but we don't know how much that research has been changed. But they really improve their ability, and they improve statistical analysis, and they improve, whatever it is that we improve, we don't know. And unless we push preprints, 91% publishers and issues cannot prove what we do. We hide behind citations, and we hide behind download statistics, as if that is just, you know, the idea of what's happening. But unless we see what is the coming in product, versus what they want, we don't know what's there. And that's one reason that I have personal evidence to, you know, sort of agree with. The other one is, never forget that if we are still at 50% of things being open access, reprints will be the only access that a lot of people around the world can have that. Now, we are different in how much we want to endorse SciHub or how much we want to endorse, you know, quantum people from other countries that have access to paper that you, because of your institution, which you don't have access to. The simplest version is that you can usually get that. And one of the reasons I'm presenting tomorrow is actually these changes that happen to documents. The majority say that the preprints don't need to flow from the published works. So if they don't, that means that you can get all the information for free using the preprints. So that's what I would encourage that.
Okay. Yes, we have two more questions, but before there was one question on chat on our Zoom, and it's really difficult. So our online participants is asking all of you, what about negative implications of open access? And he highlighted that as a young researcher, he needs to pay for 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 euros per article to be in open access. So would you like to comment this? What is the actually alternative for this and possibility for some changes? Yeah.
Yes, if you want to publish in journal, you can post it as a free. And so, yes, we need it for careers, and most likely many universities won't accept it as a peer review, but if you want to share it, share it free as a free. And that we need to redesign our own universities to reward that in the same way that we reward publishing in journal. But we cannot say that today you are unable to publish free. We are, however, everyone aware that it costs 5,000 euros for 1,000 publishers, which costs somewhere for publication purposes first, meaning Croatia, us, and the woman is working here in Central Europe. Who can pay that is very different. But if you want to share the business,
just add something because there is a myth saying that publishing in an open access journal means to have to pay for an ABC. This is a myth because there are a lot of journals, open access journals, who don't ask authors to pay. So they are called diamond journals now. And when you look at the TRAJ, you see that there are much more journals which are diamonds without charging for publishing than ABC-based journals. So I would tell the young researcher that if he or she wants to publish open access, he or she should go to DRAJ and look for the journals relevant to their own discipline and area and find the journal which is not charging for publishing open access.
So as usual, Pierre took the straight out of my mouth, but I'll just add something else also what you were saying, Maria. To the young researchers, to all researchers, most publishers do allow self-organizing, okay, under which license, but that means that you don't have to pay to publish an array. You can just store the postprint in your repository or in another repository for institutions to come from, and everybody has access, at least readable access to that content. So it's really easy to publish an array. You really don't need to pay. Thank you.
Yeah, over time, but just two very quick questions. I just want to go very briefly back to the preprint question that it was raised. I'm an advocate for preprinting, and I keep encouraging researchers continuously to use them. But I'm also very aware that we shouldn't create a preprint or perish culture. There are generally authors who are not comfortable with well, they're very aware of the improvements and changes that peer-reviewed has. They really rely on that. They're not comfortable. I mean, in physics, it took decades to get to this stage where the archive has become so populated. Well, at the beginning. And now we also have a lot of researchers who are in their field is just not common practice, and they're not comfortable with their written version being visible. So we should be conscious of that, and you know that's a reasonable concern from their side. So we should always keep that in mind. Thank you for your comments.
Hello. My question is to Delwen, and what is your effort to do biomedical studies? What is your effort in the publication of report and there was a study. There was a study showing that more than 80,000 patients that were based on retracted papers. Are you aware of any such metrics in Europe, or are we monitoring such things?
Sorry, I didn't really understand the question.
So regarding your effort to reduce the waste, you said. So how do you support registered reports by your Institute of Health? And secondly, if you are aware of any effort in Europe to monitor the participation in clinical trials that are based in retracted paper, only 20 papers. Because 80,000 between 2000 and 2010, in the US alone, 80,000 patients took part in clinical trials based on such reports.
In terms of the road registered reports, I think it's a fantastic initiative. So fully encourage that, and I think we're also trying to implement that in our own research at the institute. I'm not aware of a specific project on registered reports at the moment.
You are satisfied with that very registered reports, follow up and monitor what's happening in sites for being checked, check if the papers produce those reports are actually more reliable or more transparent than the other ones. But I think, you know, we don't necessarily need to waste those reports. You can make a great protocol in the registry, which is wasteful if you didn't very appropriate to your students. So registered reports increase our transparency of what they plan to do, but not necessarily the data they should. But that doesn't mean that every study that started as a registered report should have happened. Some of those are still situations because they weren't aware of what haven't done proper literature search, tell them not to do that study again. So there is a big effort going on right now in the United States on to reduce the number of clinical trials, small clinical trials, and small studies that are just being done for our careers rather than for actually clinical studies. So,
Thank you, Mario. We can continue our interesting discussion during the coffee break. Now it's time for coffee, and please be back at 12:15.